The candles guttered low, their flames skinned thin by draughts that stole along the vaulted ceiling. A long table gleamed with silver and crystal, platters reeking of roast and spice, the air heavy with wine and camphor. Music drifted, soft lutes, a tenor humming just behind his teeth, until a chill struck the chamber like a held breath. A cardinal, a man of red robes and high favour, rose to toast the Pope, and then, mid-sentence, his face folded as if a hand had closed over his mouth. He tottered, his goblet slipping. Dark wine fanned across the white cloth. Around him, the conversation hiccuped and died. Some guests pushed forward, others recoiled. The cardinal's eyes clouded, and within moments he lay still, the candles reflecting in the sheen of his forehead. No visible wound, no cry of murder, only the soft, certain sound of a body going silent. It is in that kind of chamber, beneath that kind of light and shadow, that the Borgia name grew teeth. Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Alexander V when he became Pope in 1492, rose from the tangled politics of Renaissance Rome by means that contemporaries, and later historians, would call brazen, even monstrous. Accounts vary as to the precise currency of his ascent. The conclave that chose him followed a deathly summer, a swirl of promises and payments, of alliances sealed with coin and favours. Simony, the selling of ecclesiastical office, was a word that moved through Rome like smoke. Some chroniclers insist the papacy was effectively bought, votes translated into sinecures, pensions, control of benefices. Others argue he profited from a court atmosphere already given to barter. The church had always been entangled with power. Yet what made Rodrigo different was how thoroughly he made the papal household serve his family. He was not the soft-spoken ascetic one would imagine when thinking of the shepherd of Christendom. He arrived at the Vatican with sons he proudly acknowledged, with ambitions that did not stop at spiritual authority. Cesare, Rodrigo's favourite, was raised in velvet and strategy. He was made cardinal in his 20s, but wore the red-like armour he was meant to discard, to move from the interior of Rome to its frontiers to fashion a state. The Pope built, armed and invested, armies under command, mercenary captains turned loyalists by pay and by marriage, cities and fortresses ceded to the family's control. Where ecclesiastical authority met temporal ambition, the Borgias laid foundations. The family's methods and the speed with which they accumulated enemies were qualities that would be memorialized by Machiavelli when he described Cesare as a living example of the new prince brave, cunning, ruthless in the pursuit of order. Machiavelli admired the way Cesare consolidated territories once given to feuding lords, the way he used both terror and clemency as tools. Yet admiration was tangled with warning. Cesare's ascent followed campaigns of sword and stratagem. He turned the papal machine outward. The Vatican became a weapon and a bank, backing agreements sealed by marriage and bloodletting alike. Into that world walked Lucrezia Borgia, who has become perhaps the most famous victim and villain of the family story. She arrived at court very young, married and remarried by diplomatic design. In those marriages, she was a piece on the chessboard, a way to hold a city or bind an alliance. But stories of Lucrezia took on a life of their own. In taverns and foreign courts, in the pamphlets and private letters of enemies, she became the face of a poison-laced household. Tales abounded that she carried a hollowed ring, a signet with a secret cup to hold a drop of the lethal cantarella, that at feasts she nodded and poisoned a rival with a sweet-tasting wine, that she smiled over the bodies of husbands and courtiers alike. Accounts vary, and here the historian must be careful. The cantarella, the name most often attached to Borgia poison, appears in later accounts and in the fevered imaginations of their enemies. Some believed it to be a rapid-acting compound, insipid to the taste, leaving no trace perfect for the silk-gloved murder that would not pluck at the legitimacy of a public family. Other scholars note that no chemical residue or medieval coroner's report preserves the recipe. Poisoning was a common accusation in Renaissance mudslinging. To call someone a poisoner was to make them beyond the pale, a threat to every banquet and bedchamber. We cannot point to a laboratory report and say with certainty that the cantarella existed as described. We can, however, point to the pattern of deaths and the atmosphere of suspicion. There were deaths that deepened the rumour. Lucrezia's second husband, the Duke of Basilie, fell suddenly from favour and life and was dead within a short span. A cardinal who had opposed certain Borgia moves was discovered unresponsive after a meal. Ambitious nobles disappeared from corridors and never reappeared in the light. In a city where few died quietly, a sudden death at a feast naturally invited talk. But those deaths also need to be situated in a Rome rife with violence, assassinations, battlefield butchery. Factional purges were frequent enough that the Borgias' victims might have fallen for purely political reasons or by the sword of an opposer. Some died of disease. Some were executed by more ordinary legal means. To single out poisoning, therefore, risks assigning intent where the record may only show outcome. Rome itself was changing. The Renaissance brought wealth and spectacle. It also brought new instruments of power. Money flowed faster, letters travelled, alliances shifted with astonishing speed. Rodrigo used his office to reward kin and to bind potential rivals with titles and land. He gave Cesare fiefs and command. He gave Lucrezia a name and, through marriage, the means of control. For many, this was a corruption of sacred trust. For others, it was simply the practice of family in a world built on patronage. Either way, the Borgias mastered the marriage of church and state. The papal tiara became a headdress that crowned a dynasty. And yet no dynasty lasts without enemies. The Borgias collected antagonists, the way roses collect thorns. Among those rivals were families with equal hunger, men who had deeper claims and thicker grudges. It is in those rivalries that propaganda germinated. Slander is easier to weave than evidence. A whispered rumour at a banquet can be repeated in letters, embroidered in pamphlets, and then taken as fact generations later. The Borgias were, for their enemies, a convenient symbol of everything Rome could be at its most venal. They were greedy, brazen, and, indeed, they did seize power in ways that outraged contemporaries. Yet the lurid details that turned Lucrezia into an archetype of a poisoner hollow rings, secret vials, the cantarella discreetly slipped into goblets, may owe as much to the inventiveness of Rome's haters as to the deeds of the family. Rodrigo's own end fits the pattern of rumour and ambiguity. In 5003, the Pope's once commanding presence diminished. He was beset by the illnesses and vicissitudes that prey on age and power alike. He died shortly after moving through a season of political defeat. Some accounts describe a feverish collapse. The official record gives disease, exhaustion, the manual causes of mortality in an era before antibiotics. Yet among whispers were those who suggested more sinister causes. Had he been poisoned? Had years of intrigues finally come full circle? Here, as with the cantarella itself, certainty eludes us. People of the day, those who could profit from defamation, were quick to suggest wounds that were invisible to the official eye. Cesare's fall, after his father's death, was swift. The power derived from the papacy evaporated when the papal protection went with it. The new political climate hunted him more than it courted him. Exiles, sieges, betrayals. He tasted all of them. He would not, in the end, be betrayed by poison at a velvet table, but by the more public humbling of war and imprisonment, dying years later on a battlefield far from the papal apartments that had once fostered his ambition. Lucrezia, meanwhile, outlived both her father and brother, carrying with her the burden of rumour. She moved to Ferrara, where she became a duchess and a patron. She bore children, managed a household, and died in 1519, her life recast in later centuries into a strange poem of villainy and virtue. When we look back, the image of a family orchestrating death at crystalline banquets is an irresistible picture. It fits into a darker narrative of Renaissance Italy, where politics were personal and mercy was thin. Yet the historian must ask, how much of that image is true, and how much is the product of rhetorical warfare? The Borgias certainly trafficked in nepotism and in the naked pursuit of power. They had a taste for spectacle and a capacity for cruelty. They also had enemies who understood the power of narrative and who could use rumour as a weapon as surely as any blade. So, the cardinal lies at the table, a goblet slipping from fingers softened by unset life, and the candles burn down to puddles of wax. Was that fall the result of a hidden vial? Was it a fever, a stroke, an assassination plotted by a household rival? The facts refuse to be tidy. They exist, at best, as fragments. An accounting of payments here, a sudden death there, a marriage that altered the balance of a city-state. Layered upon those facts are the stories of revenge and fear, of pamphlets flying across borders, of foreign diplomats adding their whispers to Rome's already noisy gossip. This is the peculiar haunting of the Borgia tale. It is both true and a legend, both a documented exercise of power and a parable of what power can look like when people choose to see only its worst face. Leaden facts, bank ledgers, titles, campaigns, sit beside rumour like two hands cupping the same small object. The Cantarella may be a recipe of smoke, or it may have been real. Lucrezia may have been a murderer, or she may have been a pawn in a more brutal game. In the end, what lingers is not a neat verdict but a question. In the candlelight of history's banquet, who poured the wine? Who raised the glass? And how much of what we drink now is truth? And how much is the flavour of a story sharpened by time and enemies?